This is my first time preaching on a Sunday morning with you. And it really is an honor to be here. But in preparing for today, I realized it's not my first time here at this pulpit with you. A few months ago, when Jill's husband, Reverend Ron's father, Dr. George Ferris, died, I was invited to step into that role so that Reverend Ron and his family, so that you all could mourn together. A eulogy traditionally is a speech honoring and praising someone after they have died. It's a privilege, I've always found, to do that. And if we all are lucky, a eulogy can do more than just calendar personal history, inventory the deeds, or even tally noble characteristics. If we're lucky, it's an invitation. It welcomes you into the life of someone who is no longer with us, into that beautiful complexity that is our lives. And if done well, it captures not only the life lived, but the life that lives on, growing within our own lives, if we're lucky. And that shift can be noted as the simple difference between counting the time past since an individual's death date and their birth date. Sarah Margaret Fuller Osceoli, Margaret, was born 205 years ago this coming May 23rd. The thread of her life through all the historical events and her amazing deeds, her noblest characteristics, her failings, her eccentricities, is perhaps most clearly summed up in her own words. Very early, she says, I knew the only object in life was to grow. It's entirely too presumptuous to say that she was the mother of our modern Unitarian Universalism, although that would be dramatic today on Mother's Day. There are just too many pieces to the puzzle of who we are as Unitarian Universalists to make that claim sincerely. However, her vision and dedication to growing as a human being was not only transformative to the spirituality, politics, and society of her time, but it continues to be an essential part of the fabric of our faith and our lives, here and now. How many of you have heard of Margaret Fuller before? Well, now I'm preaching to the choir. It wouldn't surprise most of you, though, even if you've never heard of her, that 205 years ago, the expectations and opportunities for women were limited. Schooling was not required beyond the essential skills needed to run a household. So reading, writing, and arithmetic were done at home, and no higher education was ever offered. And of course, there was no right to vote. And it's unclear if her father was a man of vision, Timothy Fuller, wanting more for his daughter than all of that, or that he simply wanted a son. The accounts differ. But the end for Margaret was the same. She was raised with higher expectations, and she rose to meet them. She learned to read by age 3. She began learning Latin and translating texts by the time she was 5. And by 9, she came to insist that she must be known in the home and in society as Margaret. Very early, she learned to directly question all of the limitations around her and more to discover her own answers and exceed them. For example, she was forbidden to read novels and plays at home. Her father believed, along with many of the time, that they were sentimental and distracting. But one day, searching through his library and all of his texts, she discovered a volume of Shakespeare. And she became enthralled by the beautiful imperfections, the comic, tragic lives, the humanity, her humanity reflected in what she read. So when she was oblivious to calls for dinner, her father sought her out and discovered what she was reading. And he made her return the book to the library and restricted her from reading it again. So he was staggered when he found that she openly disobeyed him and returned to reading the volume until she was finished. In his chapter entitled Misfit, John Matson, in his The Lives of Margaret Fuller, describes her childhood as lonely and awkward, that she was bookish, that her looks did not fit what society considered beautiful. And while she adored her father and mother and that gift of education that they gave her, they couldn't understand her. Outside her home, she was radically different from other children, with ideas and opinions and wit beyond her age and unknown in her gender. And by adolescence, Margaret recognized herself as an odd and unpleasing girl to people generally. She knew it. Yet, she would not deny or curtail herself. And it took what limited schooling that she could get to find her an outlet where she felt challenged, and she rose to overcome it. The Green Street School in Boston she attended for only 4 years, but there she won the admiration of all the older students for her intellect and found that there was no way for her to fit into Boston's society. Perhaps you, and I certainly know I have, had an experience of an awkward adolescence. It's almost the definition of adolescence itself. But much of what brings us here as Unitarian Universalists is that sense that somehow we didn't fit in other places. By her late teens, she was well known for her genius, but also for her directness and confrontational nature. More than just playing the role of an irritant, it was her hunger for deep and abiding answers beyond what intellect or society permitted that motivated her. From that reading of her letter earlier, she says, "I remember how as a little child I stopped myself one day on the stairs and I asked, 'How came I here? How is it that I seem to be this Margaret Fuller? What does it mean? And what shall I do about it?'" Raised in a privileged Unitarian household, she was well connected to the generation of ministers and theologians who founded Unitarianism. And she was connected to that emerging generation that questioned how it had become mired in intellectual idolatry. So among this new generation, her contemporaries was Ralph Waldo Emerson, Henry David Thoreau, Theodore Parker, to name a few of the familiar with whom she found a kinship. The movement within Unitarianism was entitled Transcendentalism, and it emerged from that intellectual spiritual practice to grow to include a fullness of our personal experience, our intuition, the nature of the world around us, nature itself, and the wisdom we find through our living. These were all celebrated sources reflecting back the transcendent within. Again, from that letter, I paused beside a little stream which I had envied for the full merriness of its spring life. It was shrunken, voiceless, choked with withered leaves. I marveled that it did not quite lose itself in the earth. There was no stay for me, and I went on till I came to where the trees were thick about a little pool, dark and silent. And I sat down there. I did not think. All was dark, cold, and still. Suddenly, the sun shone out with a transparent sweetness that, like the last smile of a dying lover, which it will use when it has been unkind an all cold autumn day, and even then passed into my thought a beam from its true sun, from its native sphere, which has never since departed from me. Within that transcendentalist community, she added her personal experience, her questions, and she helped to nurture and development. Oh, she was an irritant to them as well. Emerson quotes her as declaring, "I know all the people worth knowing in America, and I find no intellect comparable to my own." Many of the people at the time felt she was right. But she also won over their admiration and their adoration. Emerson also wrote of her, "She made me laugh more than I liked." And though she cherished the kinship among these leading thinkers, she found that circle to be limiting as well. And so, along with Elizabeth Peabody Stanton, she began conversations for women only, a circle of educational advancement. They sold tickets. Women of all parts of society came, and it was based on the transcendentalist approach, the salons where they sat and discussed, but it was focused on developing and adding to the education of women. She writes to Emerson, "My class is prosperous. I was so fortunate as to rouse at once the tone of simple earnestness, which can scarcely, when once awakened, cease to vibrate. All seemed to glow, and quite be as receptive as I wished. They question and examine, yet follow leadings, and thoughts, not opinions, have ruled every hour. There have been about 25 members, and every one, I believe, is in full interest." Her need for kinship, to find others like her, to find others that questioned and that began to find answers, was so deep that it took her beyond our own shores. Her clarity and persistence in articulating her own beliefs drew people to her. And so, with the Transcendentalists, she became the founding editor of the publication, The Dial. And this was the start of her literary career that earned her the title, the best read woman in America. She was an editor, a journalist, a poet. She was the first woman permitted to use Harvard University's library. She was the first woman literary critic in the United States. Her only other contemporary was Edgar Allan Poe. She was the first woman as an overseas and war correspondent. And she was the writer of 2 books, Summer on the Lakes and Woman of the 19th Century. Now, Summer on the Lakes, which came first, was more of a travelogue for her, as she journeyed out into the western frontier, which was Chicago at the time. As she explored the nature of the Great Lakes, she began to see what had happened to the native peoples. And her circle of kinship was extended. as she grew to understand that the liberation, her liberation, was tied in with the liberation of others. Woman in the 19th Century was written after she went and interviewed women from all parts of society in New England. She went to the prisons. She met the prostitutes on the docks. She met the working class women, and of course she had an access to the high class also. In her book, she not only develops the arguments of equality between the sexes, the reading that we did at the beginning of the service. She said we would have every arbitrary barrier thrown down, we would have every path laid open to woman as freely as to man. But she moves beyond that duality and asserts that this equality cannot be realized until it was extended and enfolded and holding all. African slaves, Native Americans, prisoners. She, at the time, became a well-known abolitionist, calling for reparations for Native peoples and for prison reform. But the liberation she sought was more than just intellectual, more than just New England society. And so when the New York Tribune offered her the opportunity to travel overseas and to report back on the People's Revolution happening in Italy, she took up the chance. First female war correspondent in the history of our world. And it was in Italy, as a volunteer nurse reporting back to the United States, that she met Giuseppe Mazzini, 10 years younger than her, of aristocratic birth, but a man invested, believing, and fighting for the People's Revolution. They became lovers, something that would have not occurred, was never in the possibility of New England society. And they had a son, Angelo Eugene Philip Osceoli. He was born in September of 1848, nicknamed Angelino. She embodied, finally, her beliefs. She embodied the questions of who I am and what shall I do by serving this People's Revolution, by finally finding the freedom and the responsibility to serve and to be with others. Unfortunately, at the end of that revolution, the changes they fought for were short-lived. As the tone in Italy changed, she and Giuseppe worried that they couldn't stay. Would they be accepted back in New England? What would happen to their son? They married shortly before returning, coming across that transatlantic ship travel. On the way back, the captain was struck with smallpox, and he died. And Angelino also came down with smallpox, but he lived. And due to those circumstances, the death of the captain and an unusually unseasonal hurricane, as they approached the United States shoreline, the seaman who had taken over as captain misjudged where they were and ran them into a sandbar. The ship crashed, the hurricane tore it apart. Nearly everyone lived, except with a few sea hands, Angelino, Giuseppe, and Margaret Fuller. Emerson sent Henry David Thoreau to the scene. Thoreau interviewed people over a series of days. He searched the beaches for her body, for any signs of her and her family. And this is Thoreau's account of her last few minutes. The ship struck at 10 minutes after 4 a.m., and all hands, being mostly in their night clothes, made haste to the forecastle, the water coming in at once. And there they remained, the passengers in the forecastle, the crew above it, doing what they could. Every wave lifted the forecastle roof and washed over those within. The first man got ashore at 9, many from 9 to noon. At flood tide, about 3:30 o'clock, when the ship broke up entirely, they came out of the forecastle, and Margaret sat with her back to the foremast with her hands on her knees, her husband already drowned. And a great wave came and washed her aft. The steward had just before taken her child and started for shore, and both were drowned. As she ends the letter we heard earlier, since then I have suffered, as I must suffer again, till all the complex be made simple, and I have never been in discord with that grand harmony. I shall be all human yet, and then the hour will come to leave humanity and live always in the pure ray. The Reverend Katie Lee Crane, on the bicentennial anniversary of Margaret Fuller's birth, wrote the award-winning sermon, A Conversation with Margaret Fuller. Reverend Katie writes, "Learning about transcendentalism and about you were surely my first steps forward discovering a new religious home in Unitarian Universalism." It's okay. Happens to us all. As I learned more and eventually joined this religious community, I remember saying, now this is a religion big enough to hold me. It may sound self-aggrandizing now, but it was so liberating. Reverend Katie continues, to me, there is so much that is holy. One doesn't find it in church only, or in a holy book, or even an ancient ritual reenacted every day. I see holiness everywhere, often in some very unlikely places. Discovering Unitarian Universalism was, for me, the bridge that connects intellect and intuition, and it's been opening my mind and heart ever since. I wonder if, like me, you have had the experience of coming into a Unitarian Universalist congregation and feeling liberated. That opportunity of finding one another. You're going to have to give it to me in 1 second, though. You're going to have to turn it over. The opportunity, the blessing of finding one another, of finding people who are willing to ask the questions, of finding people who are willing to discover the answers through how we live, not through our achievements, not through those people that we associate with, even though they may be as famous as Ralph Waldo Emerson. But rather that we struggle, we seek to find our answers together. And this is a legacy that Margaret Fuller gave us. It is the roots and the wings for so many of us, men and women. As she believed since she was very young. I know, she says, the only object in life was to grow. Basic definition of life itself is to breathe and to eat and to grow, and yet we know within these walls that there is another life, a growth that can continue well beyond the end of our days. May we so live. May we so find answers. May we so ask the questions today and in all the days to come. Thank you, Margaret Fuller.